Good evening and welcome to everyone who is joining us for this very important discussion today. We're very happy to have you here to engage with us. First, let me introduce Nandita to do the land acknowledgement. Thank you, Nandita.
Okay, sorry. Today I would like to honor the people whose land we live on. The Molala, the Cayuse, Tualatin Kalapuya, Willamette Tumwater, Wasco Wishram, Clackamas Chinook, and the other Chinook people of the Willamette area. We must acknowledge them as the original inhabitants of the land and recognize we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. It is in our place and duty to honor the original people and the stewardship of the land that makes up this community. Thank you.
Thank you, Nandita, for honoring the people on whose land we are. We're going to go very quickly through the mission. The mission is to educate and empower Lake Oswego residents and institutions so that we all have the tools to combat racism in all its forms and to make LO and Oregon a better place to live for all residents of all races and ethnicities. So these are difficult conversations that we're having, and so we like to have some agreements that we would like you all to accept as we go on. Number one, speak from your own experience. Use I statements, don't generalize about other people's experiences. Listen with full presence, with curiosity and openness to other perspectives. Ask clarifying questions. Assume best intent. Lean into discomfort and challenge biases. It's going to be uncomfortable. Just lean into the discomfort and challenge biases. Oops, ouch. We may stimulate pain in ourselves and in others, and so please take care of yourselves. Step up, step back. So this means speak up if you tend to hold back and listen more if you tend to talk a lot. Just let's all, push ourselves. The expected outcomes after this evening is that we will get acquainted with who is in the room and who wants to join us in responding to racism in Lake Oswego. We're not going to solve racism in 2 hours. It's not going to be done. So you will leave the meeting with more questions than you came with. You will have at least one actionable item. And then you'll also have some more ideas of how you can interrupt racism. John, let's launch our first poll this evening, please. So this first poll is how many Respond to Racism community meetings have you attended in the last 12 months? Just a single choice, please. Okay. And are we going to see the response now or after a few more seconds? So welcome to everyone who's joining us for the first time this evening. We really welcome you to RTR. Don't let this be the last time you join us, please. And to those of you who have been here before, we hope to see you again. Thank you. Thank you for your support. We're going to launch the second poll. At every meeting, we ask that you please commit to taking an action. And so the second poll is going to ask about that. Thank you. So did you take at least one of these actions? Speak up when you see sexism, be an advocate for women, insist on diversity, get trained, be an ally. Wow. So I want to acknowledge everyone who has taken an action, taken one of these actions to support anti-racism. Thank you for all that you do, and please keep up the good work. We'll check in with you again next month. And now, just moving it along, it is my great honor to introduce Willie Poinsett, one of my favorite people, co-founder of Respond to Racism and longtime Lake Oswego resident. Willie, I'm turning this over to you.
Thank you, Ada. Welcome, everyone. Hello. We have a lot of people who've registered. The last number I heard was 273. So hold the folks who are checking them in your thoughts as we go through this evening. Tonight's a special night. And it's a special night because we are talking about something that's on the minds of people all across this country. It has been the topic. Misinformation, correct information, whatever that goes in between, a little of both. But tonight it's our hope that we are going to get some answers. We're going to check our knowledge and find out if we've been right or wrong in our thinking, or maybe just misguided, I would say. And we will then move on. I want to take this time to also thank the planning committee. They worked very hard trying to pull this together. We have a few hands and a lot of work. So thank you very much. There's a lot to cover tonight, and I just wanted to plant a seed. We may need a part 2 for this discussion. So think about that. Think about what you're getting tonight. And I want to thank some other people. Last month, Radiance Talley was here as our guest speaker, a young lady who took on a heavy topic that had us talking a lot. And we need to thank her. Thank Catherine Phelps. If you haven't had a chance to meet Catherine, you've missed a treat. She has been doing our story time and all through every week in July. She did it this evening on several books. If you have young children, elementary and younger, please, please register for story time. There are such great books, and we give away books every session. But Catherine will be on vacation next week, so there'll be no story time next week. But the following week, I want to thank LO for Love for your continued partnership with us and the meditation walks that we've been doing together. Thank you, LO for Love. And it's not just the meditation walks, but they partnered with us on many things. We have another thing that's going on, Deepening Our Connections, and that's a book series on African American literature by RTR in partnership, I'm sorry, when I say RTR for the people who are new, Respond to Racism, and the Lake Oswego Public Library, and Regan Parker, a local lawyer who is helping to lead this and help to facilitate this discussion of books. And it's a book series. If you want information, go to my website and check it out. It's probably, there's still time to register, I understand, for the last book. And then I wanted to thank Serena Lum. She wrote an article, "It's important to understand anti-racism." It was published in our review last week. She is a recent graduate from our high school. And I want to say thank you so much to all of our students who've been writing. And it's just a pleasure to see young people dig into this topic and be able to write about it, their understanding. I'd like to give thanks to Bruce A. Poinsett. He's the younger, Bruce the younger, I said, but Bruce A. Poinsett, who has been working as a mentor and to help our writers, mentoring our young people, helping them with their writing. And I want to say thank you to Bruce. And Bruce is also going to be working with, as a moderator with Dr. Lynn tonight. There'll be some questions and some time for us.
You're muted, Willie.
Willie,
I guess I hit the button. I thought you muted me, John. Anyway, tonight, so tell me, where did I stop? Anywhere?
Thanking
Bruce
Dr.
the
Lynn.
younger.
Oh, Bruce the younger, Bruce A., is going to be moderating with Dr. Lynn tonight. And let me just take this opportunity to thank Dr. Marvin Lynn for his presence with us tonight and for his presentation. Dr. Marvin Lynn is the professor, and he is the former dean at Portland State University. He's a leading scholar on race and education. He's co-editor of the Handbook of Critical Race Theory and Education, along with Dr. Andrian Dixon. He serves on several national and local boards, council, committees, and so I'll just name a few. He's on the Education Recovery Committee for the Governor's Racial Justice Council, educator for Advancement Council, vice chair of the Tigard-Tualatin School Board, and the Respond to Racism Board. We're lucky. He's classically trained in opera and is also a wonderful singer. And tonight, if he gets tired of or wants to insert a song, we will accept it joyfully. He and his wife, Oswald, are the proud parents of 3 academically talented and athletically gifted boys, Wabina, Nasai, and Nana Ya. So without any further talk from me, let me open this program and present Dr. Marvin Lynn.
Thank you so much for that really, really warm welcome and invitation. I'm really honored to be here and to be with you with my Respond to Racism community. I've recently, as she noted, joined the board, and I just could not be more thrilled. I have such profound respect, Willie, for your legacy and for the amazing work that you have done and continue to do in this community. And for Trina and Pat and John and Dawn and all of those who are part of the board who've been so instrumental in making sure that I have my act together tonight. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all that you have done to help me. So I'm going to do my best to navigate the technology here and try to put some visuals up as I talk a little bit about what critical race theory is and what it's not. We will have an opportunity for you to talk with each other and answer a couple of questions, but there'll also be an opportunity for you to talk to us and to ask questions of us so that we can get a sense of where you are on this. But as you know, there's a lot being said today about critical race theory. And that is meaningful to me because as a graduate student at UCLA, are you able to see my screen? Okay. I studied critical race theory back in the 90s. There's a book back here called The Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education that I co-edited with my friend Adrian Dixon. And the first issue of that came out in 2013. And so that only happened as a result of the work that I've been doing with my colleagues at UCLA and elsewhere, really for the last 20, 25 years. And so we existed in relative obscurity. I mean, most people did not know what critical race theory was, right? And people didn't really care until recently. And so all of us who do this work and have been doing this work for as long as we've been doing it are out and about sort of talking about what critical race theory is and is not, and trying to help people get a better sense of that. So my hope is that by the end of the night, you'll have a better sense of what we're talking about when we say critical race theory, and that you'll have some deeper.
Dr. Lynn, you're muted.
Okay, did that just happen? Okay, I don't know how that happened. Okay, thank you. So I'll talk a little bit about how we use it in the field of education and so on. But you'll be astonished if all you've listened to is what's been reported on the news about critical race theory. I think you're going to be surprised at what you learned tonight. And so I'm curious, though, I think before we begin to get into that, to hear your perspective so far. I mean, all of you have come here with a sense of wanting to know, wanting to understand, wanting to share your thoughts. So we want to create an opportunity for you to do that in this next activity. So please discuss the following 3 questions in your breakout groups. First question is, what do you know about CRT? The next question is, how did you learn what you know about CRT? And then what remaining questions or concerns do you have? So we have about 145 people right now. We're going to go ahead and let you go into breakout rooms to respond to those 3 questions. What do you know? How do you know it? And what remaining questions or concerns do you have? Got it? Okay, so we'll see you in what 10 minutes, 10, 11 minutes? Back. Welcome back. I hope that you had some interesting conversation. What we're going to try to do is kind of take stock of the questions and issues that came up, and we're going to be sharing information amongst each other as a team here, and we hope to be able to address some of those things as we go tonight. So stay tuned. Let me move on to kind of give you, you had some conversation, heard from other people about what they think critical race theory is, and you got a chance to talk about it. Let me share some information with you from the experts. So the first is Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a a professor at UCLA and Columbia. Don't ask me how she does that. She's been doing it for a very long time, since I was at UCLA, and I went to UCLA in the late 90s. So one of my professors, I had a chance to learn directly from her about what critical race theory is. And she is the person who coined the term critical race theory. So she did an interview recently with it's Joy Reid at MSNBC. And this is what she has to say about critical race theory.
That I'm dumb. Is critical race theory Marxism?
Look, you know what? Here's the thing, Joy. Critical race theory is not so much a thing. It's a way of looking at a thing. It's a way of looking at race. It's a way of looking at why, after so many decades, centuries actually, since the emancipation, we have patterns of inequality that are enduring. They are stubborn. And the point of critical race theory originally was to think and talk about how law contributed to the subordinate status of African Americans, of indigenous people, and of an entire group of people who were coming to our shores from Asia. And the point was, quite frankly, to understand the problem in order to intervene in it, to understand why the greatest hopes for our republic were not being realized, even though these hopes were encoded in law. So critical race theory just inherits the beliefs and the hopes of Frederick Douglass, of Martin Luther King, who basically want the law to do for the freed people what the law did for enslavers. And we picked that up in the 70s and 80s after the civil rights movement to say, okay, so now we've had this big civil rights movement. We have all these laws in the books, but things really aren't looking as different as they should if we are really the society that we say we are. So we put about the task of understanding how law wasn't just the neutral referee. Law wasn't always on our side. In fact, law was less on our side than for on our side. And we wanted to tell these stories in order to do better with the promises that are embedded in the Constitution. That's what's in critical race theory.
So she's describing the field, right, of critical race theory. And as lawyers, as legal scholars, they were having these conversations in law journals, as you know, as she talked about the 70s and 80s and 90s. And I got into graduate school at UCLA in the 90s, and we started reading these review articles in these law journals to sort of understand these various arguments, which were critiques of the law, right, and the way in which the law was, in fact, as she. Here's another perspective that I could share with you from Dr. Prudence Carter. She is actually a professor of sociology at, now she's at Brown, she was at Berkeley at the time. So she has a very succinct sort of way of talking about and describing critical race theory. Let's see here.
A basic definitional question. When you hear critical race theory over and over again, what should people understand? How do you define CRT?
So I first want to just make a distinction between CRT, which is a theoretical framework that I learned in graduate school and read about in graduate school, versus teaching about race and racism in American history critically. So critical race theory is a framework. It's a theoretical framework that was developed in the 1980s by legal scholars to help us understand how it is that structural and racial disparities endure in our society, and how that is actually engendered in some of our laws and policies. And so the idea was to get us to think systemically, as opposed to just thinking that racism manifests by individuals just mistreating each other, that there are actual structures in our society that create these different kinds of racial gaps and racial disparities economically, in terms of housing, in terms of education. And so that's what they do, is that they actually show us how the law, how laws that are supposed to be neutral actually can promulgate or support racial disparities. That's a theoretical framework.
And then she gets into her critique of sort of what's happening now and the conversations that are going on now. But again, so you hear both of them talking about the law, right? And how critical race theory is a critique of the law and the law's inability to really uphold its promise, particularly toward minoritized communities. And these critiques, as I mentioned before, you find in mainly legal journals, which is why critical race theory was relatively obscure until now. It does not explain, though, why all this conversation is happening, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So part of what they are talking about is critical race theory as both theory and method. So it's a theoretical and a methodological approach, right, by legal scholars who are trying to understand race and racism in American society, but using the law as a frame, as a lens through which to do that. And again, they emphasize the way in which the law protects white interest and does not serve the interest of others. And the thing about this that's important is that the law is defined as neutral, as objective, as unbiased, right? And if you study the law, and those of you who have, that is the way the law is framed, and that is the way we are meant to see it. And they really question that. And I'll talk about some of those principles and values later on. So theory, the theoretical side of critical race theory, theory is a lens through which you see something. It's also a way of seeing the world, right? And so if you ask me, what is my theory about tall buildings, right? I have a way of explaining what a tall building is based on how I see the world. So it's my lens, it's my way of seeing the world. It's also my frame through which I look, right? And frames can be very narrow or they can be wide. It depends on your life experience, it depends on your education, your background, what you've been exposed to or not exposed to. But a frame is a very individual thing, and it's also tied to one's belief systems and so on. And so that's also very important. We can talk about critical race theory also as method, right? A method is a set of practices. So critical race theory is the way they approached conversations around the law. So it imbued within that was a set of practices that focused on counterstory and focusing on the experiences and telling stories that focused on or featured folks of color, for example. It was their approach to getting a story out about race in America. And it was also a strategy, right, for highlighting the concerns facing communities of color. And so critical race theory is both theory and method, okay, in these ways. More specifically, it is a critique of American jurisprudence based on the following principal beliefs, right? So there's a questioning of meritocracy. I talked about the idea that the law is objective, but there's also this notion that if you try hard enough, if you work hard enough, a very American principle, right, you will succeed. And what critical race theorists are pointing to is all the barriers in place for folks of color. And the barriers were tied mainly to race as they saw them. So they start to question, you can question this idea of meritocracy, but also the idea of objectivity and neutrality, given that structures in our society seem to be created for the purpose of serving some and not others, is what they were arguing. They also argue that racism is a normal part of American society. In fact, they argue that it's endemic to American society because of the way in which our society was begun as a slave society, as one in which natives were annihilated and removed, as one in which Latinx folks were conquered and so on. Asian Americans were excluded. So America's history is in the Declaration of Independence is something that I think people respect and value as a great set of ideals. But I think that critical race theorists would argue that we haven't really lived up to that, and that we are in our very roots and in our very foundation is this racist history that we often ignore. The interest convergence principle is another key foundational principle of critical race theory, which comes out of the work of Derek Bell. And it simply suggests that there shall be no social improvement or benefit on behalf of people of color unless it somehow impacts whites in a positive fashion. So Derek Bell used the example of Brown versus the Board of Education, right? And he argues that Brown versus the Board of Education was supposed to improve the educational trajectories of Black children in the United States, but it was only passed because of what was happening around the Cold War at the time in the country. This was the 50s, right? And so we were, quite frankly, as a nation, embarrassed by the ongoing kind of promulgation of racial discrimination in the US. And so if we passed this landmark ruling, Brown versus Board of Education, it would in fact make America look like the free and egalitarian society that we were claiming to be. So it was really an image job, so to speak. And so Brown versus the Board of Education is passed, it's landmark, it desegregates schools, but really it leads toward the desegregation of the rest of society and certainly benefited Black folks, but it only happened in that context. And that's what interest convergence is, right? That if there's going to be progress for communities of color, it has to somehow serve the interest of whites. They also believe in, and I think talk about the permanence of racism. Derek Bell, this comes out of Derek Bell's work. Derek Bell argues that because of the way our society was founded and because of the way inequality has been able to persist, that we are likely to be living with racism and that it is not going away, that what we can do is advocate against it, work against it, but it is a permanent feature of our society because of the way our society's been structured. And we can talk about that. I think there's some people in the critical race community that don't agree with that they feel like that's pessimistic. So that isn't necessarily a widespread belief among all of critical race theorists, but it's something that we mention because it comes from Derek Bell, who many regard as the father of CRT. Intersectionality, you probably have heard, comes out of Kimberly Crenshaw's work. That's a key principle because Kimberly Crenshaw, through her legal scholarship, helped us understand the way in which the courts did not understand the link between race and gender, for example, for Black women. That when Black women brought cases of discrimination into court and they argued that they were being discriminated because they were both Black and female, the courts didn't have a way to understand that. They said, no, it's either racial discrimination or gender discrimination. It can't be both. And her argument was that for Black women and other women of color, it often is both, right? That you can't separate race and gender. And people sometimes use the term intersectionality to refer to, different identities. And what Kimberly Crenshaw wants us to understand that it's not just about those identities, but it's about the ways in which people are oppressed because of these intersecting identities, right? So Black women and Latinx women and other women of color are uniquely oppressed because of the combination of those factors. And you can add other identity categories. If a person is non-heterosexual, or you've heard about what happens to trans women, right? And so they have a particular experience in the United States that is unique because of the intersection of their gender identity, their race, and their sexuality. The other thing, when we talk about method again, counter stories are the key method through which critical race theorists use to tell stories about race and racism. If you ever read any of Derek Bell's work, I talked about him earlier. His early books were all counter stories. They were fables or they were fictionalized accounts or stories or conversations between attorneys. The thing about the counter story, though, is that they are meticulously researched, and the things that the characters, which are often composite characters or made up characters, the things that the characters are talking about are actually real issues, right? And so Geneva Crenshaw, for example, in Derek Bell's book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, is talking with Belle, who is her professor, and they're fictionalized characters, but they're talking about cases in American history that actually occurred. They are citing evidence that is actually factual. And so that's the great thing about the counter story, is that the characters are made up, but the substance of the stories are very real. This is what CRT is not. It's not a curriculum, okay? And I know we keep hearing that. Now I'll go on and talk about why that is happening right now. It is not a teaching strategy. It is not a professional development module. It is not anti-white. Some of the critical race theorists are white. There's a guy named Gary Peller, who I was one of the first people I started reading, and he has a chapter in this book, Critical Race Theory, the Key Writings That Form the Movement, which is really the sort of key text of the field, right? If you want to learn about critical race theory, get this book and read it cover to cover. But you got to understand, legal language. But Gary Peller is a white guy who still is writing and speaking about critical race theory, who actually studies the Black Power movement and the intersection between Black power and race, and sort of how critical race theory evolved from that movement. So it is not anti-white. Does it critique racism and whiteness as centers of power? Absolutely, but that is not personal. It is not Marxist. Critical race theory actually evolved as a critique of Marxist legal scholarship. And so it is not Marxist at all. Is it anti-American? Absolutely not. I think critical race theorists believe that the only way to be American is to commit to improving and making America better, right? That is what the founders did. That's what Martin Luther King was about. That's what it means to be American, is to work toward the betterment of America. And I think critical race theorists believe that by critiquing and exposing race and racism, that we are making America better. We are not tearing it down. So let's talk a little bit about critical race theory in education. Now, I just told you that it's not a curriculum, right? And so it's not really being used in K-12 schools. I can talk at some point about what is happening in K-12 schools, and some of it's good, some of it's not. But again, when you think about critical race theory as both theory and method in education, these are the two ways in which we use it. And this is going to sound repetitive to you, because I want you to be sure that you kind of have some clarity around what we're talking about when we say critical race theory. But in education, we're interested in using it as a theoretical lens to understand, how does racism impact what's happening in schools, particularly as it concerns Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian American kids in schools, right? Why do we see these gaps in achievement? Historically, in the field of education, it's been defined either as gaps in intelligence or as cultural challenges, right? That Black and Brown kids came to school with a culture that simply was incongruent with school. And so critical race theory says, we're not convinced that that's what's really going on, right? That because we see these achievement gaps even in middle class Black and Brown kids, right? Between middle class Black and Brown kids and their white counterparts. And so who have a culture that's more similar to white Americans, middle class white Americans. So it's hard to argue that it's culture. There's something else going on. And critical race theorists argue that race is playing a role. And we look at race at multiple levels, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we look at it in terms of school policy and practice, how are looking at classroom practices, but also looking at leadership structures and how they support or don't support kids of color. We're also really, really interested in policies like zero tolerance policies and other policies. Higher education scholars are very interested in affirmative action and other types of policies that are meant to uphold racial diversity and are challenged because of the claim that they are in fact racist. And so they look at that and spend a lot of time talking about that. We also use critical race theory as a method to really, as I say, story the experiences of students and families and educators of color. If you study in the field of education, as I have a doctorate in education, I have a master's and a bachelor's, all in education, right? And so I'm very familiar with the field, and I'll tell you that the number of times that I have read a research study in my field of education that framed Black people as inadequate, as deficient, as unintelligent, I don't have enough fingers to count, right? And so part of what people like myself and others were trying to do is say, let's find another way to talk about what's happening with people who look like me, right? And why we may be experiencing challenges and how these broader frameworks and issues are impacting that. And we were very concerned about race because of what we see happening and the disparities we see happening, not just in education, but across our system. Here's an example of some work that comes out of education that uses critical race theory as a lens. Tara Yoso, who's a good friend of mine, we went to UCLA together, has developed this concept of community and cultural wealth. And if you study educational sociology, you hear about capital or cultural capital, which is the concept here on the left. Let's go back here. Right, and cultural capital is related to one's social class. And so if one is more middle class, then they're going to have a cultural capital that's more consistent with what schools expect to see. But it doesn't really account for issues of race and or culture, right? And that comes out of the work of critical theory. She argues that if we take a community cultural wealth framework, we can look at different types of capital that communities of color actually have because of their experiences in those communities. So familial capital, people are bringing because they have these close and deep associations with family in a kind of multi-generational way, right? That a lot of Latinx kids are coming to school having been exposed to grandparents or even great-grandparents and uncles and aunts. And so they have knowledge that is multi-generational in nature, and they have a deeper understanding of history. She talks about aspirational capital as being how people sort of see a way out of no way and are always pushing forward, right? Even when times are tough and when it looks bad. And linguistic capital is another example of kids who are bringing multiple linguistic styles to school, who are bringing multiple languages to school, and how research has finally shown that kids who are having to navigate those different languages successfully and who do that well actually are using more brain power to do that. So she is essentially using critical race theory as a framework in which to help us understand the embedded wealth that communities of color possess, right? And why we must see these the aspects of communities of color as assets and not deficits, the way they've been talked about so much in our field of education and psychology. And whatever field you're in, you have seen this occur. So I feel like this is a really nice sort of jumping off point to really think about, well, if critical race theory were to exist in K-12, right? Might it be a way to really draw on, build on the assets, the richness, the cultural linguistic richness that children are bringing to school, and that we give teachers that as a lens, as a method through which to do the work that they do. So you understand that this is very different than from what you probably are hearing and seeing on the news, right? I mean, if this is what we're talking about, this is not at all related to what is being described in the media. Let's see. So let's talk about this attack on CRT. What is it? Where does it come from? And why does it persist? All right, so here's another fun video. This is from the Heritage Foundation.
Thanks for watching the Heritage Foundation's.
She wants to ask you for money now, and I'm not going to let her. Okay. So completely opposite to everything I just told you, right? And this piece, when you look up what is critical race theory, this is the most watched piece, right? It's 1.5 million people have viewed this, right? And you see why. It's nice music, like you want to dance. I mean, it's pleasant music. The images are pleasant, right? Lots of diversity in the imagery, but what they're telling you is absolutely not true. And so it's a disinformation. It's part of a disinformation agenda. Here's another really interesting video that's also gotten lots of views. And unfortunately, I'm giving it more views by watching it. But I think we need to be educated about this. So I don't cringe about watching these things. Okay, this is the next one. Let's see. Yeah. This is a little longer, so I'll cut it off.
Have you heard about critical race theory? I'm guessing you probably have. It has already insinuated itself into many institutions and is making rapid progress into others. If it takes hold, it will completely change the very nature of America and the way you live. Critical race theory holds that the most important thing about you is your race. The color of your skin, that's who you are. Not your behavior, not your values, not your environment, your race. In critical race theory, if you are a member of a minoritized racial group, their term, not mine, you are a victim of a system that is rigged against you, a system that doesn't want you to succeed. On the other hand, if your race is privileged, you're an exploiter, whether you intend to be or not. Critical race theory begins from the assumption that racism occurs in all interactions. To see how this works, consider this thought experiment. Imagine you own a shop and two customers enter at the same time, one white and one black. Who do you help first? If you help the black person first, critical race theory would say you did so because you don't trust black people to be left alone in your store. That's racist. If you help the white person first instead, critical race theory would say you did so because you think blacks are second-class citizens. That's racist too. That's critical race theory. It can find racism in anything, even if it has to read your mind to do it. Critical race theory is a uniquely American invention. Brewed up at Harvard Law School in the 70s, now part of the academic and media mainstream, it is also uniquely un-American because it rejects the core tenets of the American classically liberal Judeo-Christian value system. It turns the bedrock American idea upside down. Here it is in the words of Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk, two leading proponents. Critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and the neutral principles of constitutional law. It does this because critical race theory proponents assume racism is present everywhere and always, and they look for it critically until they find it. And they always find it. It has to be there because that's how the imperial European powers and then America set things up. Here, as in all dangerous academic theories, there is a kernel of truth. Yeah. Human beings were not preoccupied with race until the 16th century, when Europeans began to explore and then colonize other parts of the world. Drawing distinctions between the races reached its peak in the 19th century with the widespread use of slave labor in North and South America. No one denies this. But since then, the Western world, and most especially America, has spent a lot of time, money, and blood breaking free of its racist past. It's been a
That's where we depart. He was making some decent points there for a second. It's like, oh, wait a minute. So now we're done with all of that, right? No. But you see how this discourse, I think, sort of goes astray. I think there are moments of clarity and truth in some of it, but it goes so far in the other direction to make critical race theory or any critique of race and racism in America as very one-dimensional, one-sided. And quite honestly, Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk, for example, yes, are key figures in CRT, but not everybody in the movement agrees with them. And so it's hard to say, that this is emblematic of all critical race theorists and so on. So here's another important figure, Christopher Ruffo. Christopher Ruffo is what I would refer to, and I think the New Yorker, this is the title of a New Yorker article that came out in June, that points to his intentional effort to really mislead the public about critical race theory. That they describe the way in which he set about to respond to a professional development session that he saw in Seattle. And I'll play a video that talks about it a little bit. The professional development session, I forget the name of the company who was responsible for it, they were asking white people to reflect on their whiteness and so on, and he had a problem with that. And as he read on in the notes that he saw with respect to that session, he saw references to work by people like Robin DiAngelo and Derek Bell. And when he saw Derek Bell's work, he saw the term critical race theory, and without reading any of the literature, he decided that he would refer to everything that he didn't like as critical race theory. That's a bit of an overstatement, but it's not entirely far from the truth. But he also admits that he was intentional about using critical race theory really as kind of a catch-all term to refer to a variety of things. And in this interview that he does with my colleague, Mark Lamont Hill, and this is the last video I'll play, kind of captures some of that for you. So let's see here.
Welcome back to Black News Tonight. The attack against teaching critical race theory in schools continues with full force. Over the weekend in Texas, the state Senate passed a bill to ban the theory, joining nearly a dozen other states who have already banned it or are well on their way to signing it into law. There is one person who is the proverbial engine behind these efforts. His name is Christopher Ruffo. He is the man who is the primary advocate calling for the removal of the theory from schools and other governmental institutions. Last night, he tweeted, and I quote, "In less than a year, my work inspired a presidential order, legislation in the largest red states, and bills in the House and Senate. We have flipped school boards and protected millions from state-sanctioned racism." And yesterday he also tweeted, and I quote, "I learned about racism, slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, and the Trail of Tears in my K-12 education. I never learned about the Holodomor Cultural Revolution and 100 million dead from global communism. Americans haven't whitewashed history, they've red-washed it." So I wanted to discuss this in detail, not with someone like Vernon Jones was here a few weeks ago, who had no idea what critical race theory was, much less being able to sort of articulate a coherent thought about it. Instead, I wanted someone who has thought about this a great deal, worked very hard on his particular project to advance his work, and he generously accepted my offer to come on Black News Tonight. So joining me now is Christopher Ruffo. He's a senior fellow at Manhattan Institute. Christopher, thank you so much for joining me. One of the things that you tweeted was this idea of critical race theory being state-sanctioned racism. What makes it that?
Yeah, I think it's an accurate description, because critical race theory, as it's practiced in institutions, as it's adopted in places like public schools, engages in practices that can only be described by any rational person as a form of state-sanctioned racism. In San Diego, they told teachers, quote, "You are racist, you are upholding racist ideas simply because of the color of their skin." In Cupertino, California, for example, they separated third graders. These are 8 and 9-year-olds. They forced them to deconstruct their racial and sexual identities, and then separated them into people who had power and privilege and people who did not. And finally, a place like even Springfield, Missouri, not exactly a blue city or a blue state, they told white male Christian teachers that by their inborn characteristics, they were inherently oppressors and had to atone for their covert white supremacy. Again, not judging people on their behavior, their character, their actions, their beliefs, just judging them on inborn characteristics, particularly race.
Okay, so there's two things you said there that I find incredibly interesting. Let me start with the easier part, right? And that is, you say critical race theory as it is practiced. Do I take that to mean that you don't have a problem with critical race theory as it was designed by critical race theorists, as scholars discuss it, but you're saying that in practice there's some gap between how it's conceived and how it's executed?
Yeah, I think actually both are extremely problematic. On a theoretical level, I think critical race theory is an intellectually bankrupt theory, but in itself, it's harmless. Ideas in theory and the abstract are not necessarily harmful. I would support schools, for example, teaching critical race theory as one of many theories and then offering a critique. But what we're seeing that in practice, critical race theory across a wide range of institutions, including the federal government, including public schools. Actually, when it's actually implemented, teachers are engaging in practices that can only be described as, again, a form of state-sanctioned racism, promoting the ideas of race essentialism, that you can reduce people to their racial essence, the ideas of collective guilt, that if someone has a similar characteristics as someone who committed a historical crime, that person should be held accountable and guilty for it. And finally, in some places, they're actually reviving racial segregation. A place like King County, Washington's public libraries now separates some training sessions for employees with one door and one room for people of color, one door and one room for white employees. And it's really simple. All forms of racism are wrong. It doesn't matter if they're coming from the Klan or practitioners of CRT. I oppose all of it.
Right. So there's kind of a circular logic there, though, right? If you're saying CRT is racist because they do things that are racist and you oppose racism, I think where we have to sort of unpack this a little bit is, one, the premise that pointing out racism or saying that people, by virtue of their whiteness, are responsible or accountable for the power and privilege that they hold. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced, or you have yet, to me, based on the reading that I've done of your work and the speeches that you've given, made a compelling argument for how pointing out power and privilege within the context of a society is itself an act of racism. And just to be clear, the argument of critical race theory isn't that by virtue of some biological determinism, that is to say, it's not because you come out of the womb with white skin that you are racist. It's to say that we live in a society that grants differential power and status to people based on how they are racialized. And by virtue of that, there is a racial dynamic and there is a racial inequality that's produced. And so telling white people that, yeah, in a white supremacist world, whiteness has power, whiteness has the ability to control, whiteness has the ability to be viewed or constructed as more beautiful, more smart, more sane, more rational. That, to me, I'm not convinced that you've made the case that that is an act of racism in and of itself. Could you help me understand that more?
Yeah, so that continues where Mark says, hey, you're not making sense. In fact, you're lying. And you can see the look on Christopher Ruffo's face where he's embarrassed to be there because he knows that he is stretching the truth, so to speak, right? And all of the different incidents that he describes, some of which have occurred, some of which haven't. You may be aware the Tiger Tarleton Schools was a subject of an attack by this man. There was an article written called Child Soldiers or something, and he focused on 3 Portland area school districts, and we were one of them. Portland Public Schools was another. And I forget what the third one was, but he essentially said he talked to people on the inside who told him all these things about stuff that was going on, and some of it was just made up. So he's being kind of uncovered as someone who really isn't steeped in, unfortunately, the truth. But I've been saying, if you read in the articles that I'm quoted in, and that some of them were early on, I was being asked about this back in the fall of 2020. People were asking me, hey, is critical race theory in the schools? And I kept saying it's absolutely not. And I had a gentleman that wanted to interview me for a newspaper article, and I refused to interview with him because this doesn't exist. What is it that you want to talk about? What I didn't know was that this was this buildup, right? That was coming, and that so many people across the United States would be angry, and that there'd be all this legislation. We've seen legislation in Idaho. We've seen it in places like Texas and Georgia and so on, essentially banning critical race theory from in some cases, K-12 schools and higher education, right? The legislation in Idaho doesn't ban critical race theory per se. What it says is that you cannot recruit kids to be advocates against racism, and you can't force them to participate and to become anti-racist, I think is what it says. It doesn't say you can't teach it. And I don't know that you can legislate what can be taught and what can't be taught. But what this has done is it has scared many educators, many who are really afraid to deal with certain subjects in the classroom. And I think educators, both in elementary, high school, but also in the university, people are not sure what can and cannot be discussed. And so I've had conversations with Representative Courtney Nerone here in Oregon about what the legislators in this state can do to ensure that people feel comfortable teaching CRT in the classroom. So I think we're at the point now where we're supposed to take a break and have some Q&A, and then we're going to come back and talk about sort of advocacy efforts. Is that my understanding, Pat and or Trina? Is that right?
That sounds good.
Sure.
So what are your, is there somebody going to facilitate?
So Bruce is up. Dr. Lynn.
Okay.
Can you unshare your screen, Dr. Lynn?
Oh, yes, yes,
Awesome.
yes.
Thank you so much.
Bruce.
Yeah, are we
okay.
Are we taking a break or are we?
Oh no, you're up. You're up.
Q&A, Bruce.
Q&A, Bruce.
Can people hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, we had thanks everyone for participating in the chat. We had a lot of lively responses. So it's a lot of questions. Many of them were kind of answered during the presentation, but I think one of the recurring concerns that looks like is on a lot of people's minds, Dr. Lynn, is how do you deal with the misinformation, whether it be how do you combat it, or a lot of people, or I shouldn't say a lot of people, but some people in the chat have even asked, is it worth it to try and engage with some of this, just blatant disinformation? So how would you respond to that?
Is it worth it? It's absolutely worth it. I think that, as I read more about Christopher Ruffo, it became very clear that he was kind of like a lead agent of what has been referred to as a disinformation campaign, right? And folks on the far right use different disinformation campaigns as a way to control and manipulate people. And I'm a person who does not like to be controlled or manipulated. So the whole idea that somebody thinks that I'm dumb enough to be controlled by something that they create, something that they make up, annoys me. And I think the average American, right, whatever your political beliefs, you don't want to be manipulated and lied to for the purposes of supporting the future political campaign of a tyrant, of an authoritarian leader, which is what this is ultimately about, right? This is really about lifting Trump up and turning away from the kinds of policy issues and conversations that I think we could be having, and turning us toward fear, so that we use that as an impetus to get people back to the polls to support this guy. It's absolutely worth it.
So along those same lines, I have a question here from the Travis S. Says, am I wrong when I draw a straight through line from the era of McCarthyism with CRT replacing communism as the modern political boogeyman? for that matter, aren't they also repackaging Marxism along with CRT to make it seem extra scary?
Absolutely, absolutely. And critical race theorists were talking about the McCarthy era all the time because it feels like that, because people who are doing this work are now being called out and threatened, and in many cases losing their jobs, right? Because of this legislation that we see across the nation. It is absolutely a terrible time for people who are doing this work and who have set about doing this work for the last 30 years. Not because the work itself is so dangerous, but because what people have been led to believe about it is dangerous and threatening. And it is as anti-democratic and as un-American as McCarthyism was, because what it suggests is that you have to think in a particular way, that you cannot, that if you have a criticism about racism in the law or anywhere else, that you are somehow un-American, right? That free thinking then is squashed. It's critical race theory today, tomorrow it'll be feminism, and then it'll be something else. I mean, so it won't stop at critical race theory. And I think we have to understand this as an attack on democracy, absolutely.
So this isn't actually a question in the chat, but I just wanted to follow up on that. Could you, when we talk about some like the other, I guess, like isms, like you talk about tomorrow will be feminism, next day will be, can you just kind of expound upon, that interconnection?
Right. I mean, I was surprised at, Trump's executive order, which again, Ruffo encouraged that. He wrote to the president at the time and said, hey, we need to get rid of critical race theory, here's why. And Trump said, absolutely, here's an executive ban on critical race theory. And so he's responsible for that. He's also responsible for writing a template of all this legislation that we've seen across the country, right? Because it says essentially the same thing. But embedded within the executive order was not just an attack on race, it was also an attack on people who are critical of patriarchy and gender norms, right? So it said we cannot have critical conversations about race or gender. And I didn't see the feminists sort of rise up against that, and I wish I had, but I think that there's a sense that any critique of America, and I think because of what happened with George Floyd and because of the conversations we've been having for the last year and a half, we have been very focused as a nation on race. And so race was the easy target. But I think if you really listen to these folks, they're not just concerned about racial critiques, they're concerned about critiques of sexism. They're concerned about the queer studies movement, right? LGBT folks, they're concerned about gay marriage. They're concerned about sex education. They're concerned about a whole range of issues that have absolutely nothing to do, but do relate to and connect to critical race theory. I think that critical race theory is used as what I call a moniker for a whole range of concerns that we in the social justice community have that have to do with race and a range of other issues. Disability, for example, is another issue that I think that has been ignored. And I think we can see examples historically of leaders who have undermined our ability to really care for those and have laws that really protect the rights of those who have disabilities in schools. And all of this stuff is in tandem with each other.
So another thing that's kind of been touched on by some people in the chat is just, you talked about Ruffo, but also, as some of the things touched on in the chat is just the moneyed interest behind a lot of these efforts. Can you just kind of talk more about sort of like the infrastructure behind this campaign?
Yeah, Carol Green, I was on here, but we had a conversation with Carol recently about and Carol, maybe you can chime in and respond to that too, about how organized the right is, right? And how much money there is behind these. Somebody asked a question about what's the difference between disinformation and misinformation. Well, disinformation is an intentional effort to mislead. we sometimes give out misinformation without knowing it, right? You know, I'll give you the wrong date for a chapter of a book or something. That's misinformation because I was just wrong. But disinformation, you know you're wrong and you are misleading people on purpose because you're trying to get them toward something, and that is to vote Republican and to vote for, Trump in 2024, quite honestly. But there's a very, very well-oiled machine in place, and there's a lot of moneyed interest. The Heritage Foundation is a central part of this, but also the Manhattan Institute. And there's a strategy, right? It's about using I'm trying to get what I was going to say is using scholarship and using but they're not really using scholarship. Like Christopher Ruffo would say, he's done studies, and they're not studies, so I can't really call them that. But they're using some form of scholarship to create a knowledge base about the things that they care about and believe in, and to advance their political beliefs. And those are well funded, right, by very, very wealthy people and organizations and PACs. Carol, do you want to say anything more about that? Because I know you are very astute about sort of the political and economic structure of the right, and how this is working to move this forward.
Well, I would raise the issue of our loss of a number of seats in school boards around our state as a first step, and that it's sort of a measure that has happened on all levels in the nation recently, using what I call, not that critical race theory isn't important in its own right, but it's a straw man that's used to get people upset and angry and not look at the real issues, which is that the average life expectancy has dropped for middle-aged, middle-class men. And instead of being upset about that, they get them upset about critical race theory. And this is coming from, I think, a very well-organized, fairly long-term organization from the very top that is, well, many of us have been working hard to make things better. They've been working very hard to have a structure that can fight our advancement at all levels. So I could talk a lot more, but I will stop.
Thank you, Carol. Carol, tell them what your role is in Washington County.
I'm chair of the East Washington County Dems and a Democratic House District Leader. We are working to elect good people at all levels, and also to work on policy once we elect people. I also serve on the Washington County Behavioral Health Council. And so we see every day the devastation that we need to address.
Yep. And because of Carol, I work as a PCP, as a precinct captain. Is that what it stands for? And so you get involved in the political process, and we'll talk about kind of how you can advocate a little bit later, because I've seen people starting to ask about that. Thank you, Carol.
Just to kind of follow up on that, in terms of, I think we always hear about the importance of making sure we get people in these seats who, can be, whether it be, advocates, or at least, open-minded. But in terms of like the difficulties in actually making that happen, or in, Dr. Lynn, obviously you just ran for school board. Can you just talk about, like, I think sometimes the details can be really what the details in getting there can be what really, people just stumble upon. So yeah, can you just talk about that a little bit?
About sort of getting involved in politically and getting the right people in place? Well, when you said that, Bruce, I thought we are the right people. That's really why I ran for school board. I've served on the school board, and I had no intention. Precinct committee person, thank you. I said precinct captain. I'm new, I'm learning, I just joined. But become a PCP, it's important. But we have to run. And we have to support our neighbors and our friends and other people to be involved in politics. And for me, it was the school board, because I wanted to ensure that the school board would continue to focus on equity, because there are a lot of voices in my community saying we should not be doing this work. And the superintendents need support. They need school board members who are going to support their efforts to continue to focus on equity in these school districts. And so that's why I ran. That's why I sit there, and I'm there to support this great work. And we are the people that we are waiting for. Is what I would say. This idea of Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or Fannie Lou Hamer coming along. Willie is our Fannie Lou Hamer right now, right? But we are the ones we're waiting for, and we have to get involved. And people like Carol Greenow and others can tell you how to do that if you're looking for a way to do that.
Let's see. Sorry, just I'm scrolling through for some more things we haven't really covered yet. I think another thing people kind of touch on is just like at a base level, the fact that we're combating a campaign that really, really taps into fear. So like, how would you say we can, again, just kind of like, understand we're fighting at a base, we're fighting fear. What is something we can use to really, I guess, get people's attention in a, at least like equally effective way?
Yeah, I think what we're doing tonight is part of that, is education. I'm an educator by that's just, I've always been a teacher, and I do believe that education, I believe that knowledge is power. I think a lot of people are misinformed because people in power with a lot of resources and time and the ability to make really glitzy videos that have great music are intentionally misinforming folks. And I do believe that if we set about trying to get the right information out there, help people understand what's really happening, and engage people in conversation, that we can turn that around. I don't think we are nearly as organized as the right is, and that's a problem. I think Cheryl would agree with that. I've been talking with my fellow critical race theory folks for a while now about what are we doing? We got to put together our own campaign to sort of demonstrate what critical race theory is. We've got to give examples. To date, we really don't have a K-12 curriculum based on critical race theory. And so not only is that not true, it's also something that is frustrating for me, because I think it's something we probably should have, right? And so we have a lot of work to do in terms of not just being reactionary and fighting misinformation, but also making sure that people do understand the work that we're trying to do and why it's so important. I've been on a couple of conservative news channels talking about some of the incidents that Christopher Ruffo describes, and I would agree with him and others who argue that some of those practices are inappropriate, right? If it's true, and again with Christopher, you don't know if it's true, but if it's true that a teacher is taking second or third graders and dividing them up into oppressor-oppressed class, I would disagree with that as a strategy, as a practice for trying to teach kids about race. There are other ways to do that. So we could be putting information out there about what's developmentally appropriate. How do you teach about race in ways that actually are developmentally appropriate, that actually speak to the sort of emotional and social needs of kids of all backgrounds, right? How do you do that? And we could be talking about that a lot more. And so that's my commitment, is to trying to bring my community of folks together to really respond to some of those questions and be as good at putting information out as the right is, because I think that's where we fall down. And I think they have an audience that I think we could capture if we were more adept at sharing information.
So real quick, I just want to, in case there's a confusion earlier about some of the political stuff, I'll actually just read Terry's comment here because I think it sums it up pretty clear. We love our community members stepping up and serving. The RTR is a 501c3, and we do not endorse candidates. We do hold forums so that our community can ask questions and hear from candidates on important issues. So just to clarify that, again, our RTR does not endorse candidates. Back to the questions. I think Chris McCann asks, I wonder how intertwined CRT bans are with separation of church and state and the reluctance to separate the two.
What about the separation of church and state? What's the question?
Yeah, I wonder how intertwined CRT bans are with the separation of church and state and the reluctance to separate the two.
Yeah, and this, there's an argument out there that critical race theorists don't believe in the principles of democracy and freedom. And I think critical race theorists would argue that, they absolutely believe in the democratic principles. And one of those is the separation of church and state, right? That kids in school shouldn't be made to feel like they have to endorse a particular religion. You shouldn't feel like you have to endorse any particular religion at work, right? And especially in a public environment. But and so, I think principles such as that we absolutely believe in, and we do see a kind of conflation of church and state oftentimes on the right, and religion is, I believe, misused as a tool to get people in the door. And there's a particular interpretation of Christianity that I disagree with, that's often used as a way to draw people in who have very conservative, oftentimes exclusionary beliefs about who can and cannot be a Christian. If that's what you're asking, Bruce. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it was Chris's question.
Okay.
And he said that was very helpful.
Okay.
We have a comment here from Colleen Davis. So just all kinds of Ainsworth connections in the Zoom tonight. But it says educators need to stop buying textbooks from Texas, use Rethinking Schools and Zen for curriculum. But kind of similar to the infrastructure question from earlier, could you just talk about sort of like the role this textbook publication is playing right now, not necessarily in critical race theory, but in dictating, I guess, like how schools teach about race or don't?
Well, that's the conundrum right there. It's that, Christopher and his friends are claiming that schools are being flooded by critical race theory, but we know that the majority of textbooks that students are using in schools don't mention half the topics that I think need to be mentioned. All the things that he says he learned about in the school, I'm thinking, gosh, what school was that? Because I didn't learn any of those things. And most of our kids don't learn those things. I think a lot of the history of minoritized communities is left out of these textbooks. And we certainly don't understand the incredible role that communities of color have played in all of the disciplines, right? You'd be surprised to learn about the role that Black people, for example, played in medicine and in mathematics and science and so many fields. And so kids aren't learning that stuff, and our textbooks are not teaching that. And so the current effort, I think, is really a way to sort of make sure that that doesn't change. In fact, that it gets even worse. You've seen Texas take some even extra steps to try to limit the teaching of slavery in its textbooks, even though it was already woefully insufficient. And so we still have a major curriculum problem in this country. And for somebody to try to convince us to believe that there's something other than that happening, I think is, again, disinformation. It's an intentional effort to mislead people and to make them fearful on the basis of a lie.
Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Am I frozen?
No, we can hear you.
No, you're good.
Okay, so saw a comment in here. It says, one really strange thing I have seen as a school psych grad student is parents conflating SEL, social emotional learning, with CRT, for example, saying that using culturally and linguistically diverse materials is CRT. Yeah, can you just talk about, I guess, have you seen things to that degree, whether it be in Tigard or, in some of these other examples, just kind of around the state?
Well, what the Heritage Foundation did, and there is a pamphlet that I saw, and I'll find it and share it with the organizers, and maybe they could send that out to everybody. But the Heritage Foundation, I think it was them who created a pamphlet that basically said to its community that yes, CRT is a euphemism for a whole range of ideas. And they include social emotional learning, they include culturally responsive teaching, critical pedagogy, a whole range of things that they argue are code words for CRT. And Christopher Ruffo, he has a video that he produced that also says, hey, they might be saying equity, but what they really mean is CRT, right? And they might be saying equality, but what they really mean is CRT. So he's trying to get people who are part of that community to basically read anything that has to do with social justice, equity, culture, gender, sexuality, right, as CRT. And so they're putting everything under that frame. And it's a complete misreading, right, of what CRT is, but it's also doesn't give credit to the work that people have done to try to advance equity pedagogy. Equity pedagogy has been around for about 40 years. I mean, it was, people were trying to do equity pedagogy in schools before critical race theory was even a thing, because of the historic challenges that kids of color have had in our schools and the efforts that teachers have been trying to make to try to right the wrong, so to speak, historically, that our kids have experienced, particularly kids of color who are poor. So there have been efforts all along the way to try to address some of these ongoing challenges in schools that have had nothing to do with critical race theory as a legal scholarly movement that is now being used as a framework in educational research. Again, do we need to be thinking about how we use CRT as a frame to situate curriculum and pedagogy in K-12 schools? I think so, but it's people like me that have to do that work. And fortunately, I think I'll have a little bit of time to do that.
We have time for one more question.
So we have a question here from Linda Lovett. It says, have either CRT opponents or proponents or opponents tied/conflated the theory to the issue of reparations?
Again, any kind of challenge to the broader system at this point is being conflated as CRT. So I haven't specifically heard that one. I'm not sure if that's on the list of about 200 terms. It might be, but I would guess that it would be. Anything that represents a challenge, particularly a challenge to the system on behalf of a racially oppressed or marginalized community, is going to be construed as CRT in this current environment. So yes.
Thank
All right,
you.
go ahead.
Thank you. So, Dr. Lynn, did you have, you can go ahead and go on with the rest of your presentation
So
as our time's getting short soon.
Really quickly,
Okay.
5 minutes or less, to talk about kind of what we can do, some things we can do. And what I wanted to do is kind of have a list of resources. And the truth is there isn't a lot out there right now in CRT. And it's work that we've got to do. But here's some things you can do right now. We've already talked about a few of them. School boards are under attack. School boards need your support. You can write letters. People are writing letters to the school board all the time. I'm on the board now about. I had a lady the other day says, I'm not a Republican, but please stop teaching CRT in the schools, right? And that's of course not happening, but she's listening to people who are telling her that it is. And so we need people to write to the school board to say, please continue this great equity work that you've started and do more of it. So if everybody did that, who was in this meeting today, we'd be in great shape, I think. Run for school board. I said that before. We need people to run. You need to get involved in progressive political efforts and so on. Yeah, we're not advancing or supporting any particular candidate, but politics do matter. Engage with the RTR, with Respond to Racism in terms of helping to advance that agenda and offering support to what they are trying to do. I think this stuff happens in community, and it's the coming together in community that I think is going to make a difference. You can write opinion pieces for the local paper that support equity efforts. Again, we keep hearing the loud voices on the right. We're not hearing enough voices on the other side, on other sides of that. I mean, you don't have to be leftist per se. You can be kind of down the middle, but what we're hearing are the most conservative voices that are flooding the media and flooding the school boards with their views on what should be happening. And that does impact the direction of public policy. I think we need to continue to educate ourselves about what is going on, about sort of what we need to be focused on, what we need to be learning. And so I try to stay abreast of the literature, and I'm always reading a book or two on the topics that, like white fragility is something that is very controversial now because Ruffo and others have identified it as something that's an attack on white people. But I think it's important to understand what that is about and how white fragility is used as a tool to stymie conversations about race. And we see that in the workplace. So I think the book clubs and the further exploration of these issues is really important. This is going to sound kind of theoretical, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but, I talked about this concept of community cultural wealth. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful concept. And it really belies this whole idea that critical race theory in schools or in education is somehow used as a way to indoctrinate kids to hate white people or to hate themselves as white people. That this is really about recognizing the wealth that all kids bring to the classroom and drawing on that as a way to structure professional development with teachers, to have teachers structure lesson planning activities, right? I mean, what would it look like for a third grade science lesson that really viewed the students as like holders of cultural wealth and knowledge that was valuable, that could be incorporated somehow into the curriculum, right? I mean, this is beautiful stuff. And this is the possibility of critical race theory within the K-12 context, because again, this concept comes out of critical race theory. And so I'm committed to trying to work with my friend Tara Yoso, who I just talked to today. We did an interview with the LA Times, which should be coming out shortly about all of this. But my commitment is to working with her and others to try to bring this out in the field. I think, we should be using critical race theory as a lens to examine history, ethnic studies, right? I mean, the incorporation of ethnic studies into the traditional history curriculum is one way to do that, because it speaks back to what we would refer to as a majoritarian or stock story that really ignores the critical histories of Indigenous and Black and Latinx and Asian American communities. And so we have to be very intentional about the incorporation of ethnic studies of all kinds. And I would argue gender studies and queer studies as well. We have to also, I developed a term in the late 90s called critical race pedagogy. And I was interested in sort of how are teachers of color using critical race ideologies or thoughts or beliefs as a way to frame classroom discussions about race. Now, the teachers that I was studying had no familiarity with critical race theory, but they had come out of maybe a more sort of nationalist background, or in some cases were involved in the Black Panther Party, right? And so they had experience as activists, as people who are committed to equality in their community, and they were talking to their kids about race. And so critical race pedagogy came out of that. And these teachers were centering classroom discussions on race, and again, using US history as a lens and looking at it through the lens of slavery and xenophobia and others, but really honoring student experience. What are students bringing to the table? I observed a teacher here in Portland who was really drawing on the experiences that students were having as they were being followed around in their local shops, right, because of the color of their skin and what that meant. And he was using that as a way to teach certain concepts in history and social studies. So that kind of thing should be happening. It is not happening to the extent that they say it is. The teachers in my work also challenged racist policy and practice and were advocates for change on behalf of their students. And so we could think about expanding critical race pedagogy as a way, or critical race teaching, you could say, as a way for that to begin to happen. And then I think we have to look at the curriculum. The curriculum is a problem. It is old, it is outmoded, and it does not speak to the needs and the experiences and the cultures of our students. So I think critical race theory could be used as a tool to advance education in this country. It certainly has not been, but I think I have felt encouraged by this in a way to begin that process. So thank you very much for your time and for your thoughtful questions and responses. And I look forward to continued conversations with all of you as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lynn. Dr. Lynn, did you also want there was another question about, did you also want to hear from a few people about their thoughts about if their understanding of CRT has shifted?
Sure, let's do it.
So if anybody want to just raise their hand for a couple of people. The question was, how has your understanding of critical race theory shifted tonight?
And there's still over 100 of you out there, so somebody speak up.
Well, I guess I'll say something. People aren't speaking. Yeah, I think that the slideshow, I would love to see that and keep it. I think it just gave a way to speak about what it is and what it's not. I had heard before, for instance, that it was grounded in law, but now I understand that better. I think it was helpful because sometimes I want to talk a little bit about what it is, but then just general concepts around anti-racism and different things kind of bleed into my mind. And so it was helpful to know what are the bounds of specifically of critical race theory, because a lot of the ways we can stop the problem of people saying all the things that it's not is also by knowing what it is and what it's not. So that was very helpful.
Yes, that I felt the same way. It really gave me a much more concise way of explaining the issues. Thank you very much, Dr. Lynn.
Thank you both, Jan and Marchita. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me now? Is it my turn?
Yes.
I just want to thank you, Professor Lynn, for being here tonight. It's been a very interesting conversation. But there was a question I entered in the chat that I really didn't get an answer to. And I was wondering about your distinction between how equity is used these days in comparison to equality, and how that translates in reality, and what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, I would say very briefly that equity is about giving people what they need to be successful. And equality is really about making sure that everybody has access to the same thing. So, you know, when we were fighting against segregation, we were fighting for equality because there were stark differences between what Black people had and what white people had, right? You could see, even with the water fountains, right? So we just wanted the same thing. We wanted access to the same thing. And so that was a particular stage, I think, of the movement. And now I think what we're much more interested in is making sure that while we are in the same environment, that we are paying attention to the unique needs of the individual students, for example, in the classroom. And that's a more equity-based approach.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Willie?
Yes. Did you call me?
Yeah. Yep. Do you want to wrap up?
Oh, sure. So I saw several people indicate that they wanted some more of this. So, Dr. I have to be nice when I try to ask her, Dr. Lynn. Would you be willing if we have a part 2 of this at some time, helping us out? I hate to put you on the spot like this.
Sure, and I
But
think, yeah, I think we can talk about the strategies and practices, you know, a little bit more and maybe talk less about the theory.
that would be great, because I saw some really good things come through the chat, and hopefully we'll have the chat saved for you so that you can read the comments that people made. The idea that we are doing something bad to kids by teaching critical race theory, it's just needs to be stopped. Stopped. And I'm happy that people tonight have commented that they understand critical race theory more now than they did coming in. So you were a success there. And so we always look for those things. I thank you because you put a lot of thought into this and a lot of time. And I really, really appreciate it. We appreciate you. I'm speaking for everyone here on the call. This is something you have educators. I think the superintendent of Lake Oswego was here on the call tonight, or someone from the office, and we need support. Our parents need support. They need to understand, or they're looking for clearer understanding of what critical race theory is and what it is not, because it becomes confusing. And I think you gave us some key words here that we should look out for, and I appreciate it. And we'll look for, let's see, are you doing another poll or are we finished with polls?
Yes, we have one
Dawn?
more. We have one more before.
Okay. Bruce, thank you for being the moderator. While we're talking about poll 3, while you're filling out poll 3, this will be very helpful for us in planning our future meetings. So, did you learn something new this evening? Did you hear a different perspective? And can you commit to an action proposed tonight?
Thank you.
Okay. Pat, are you going to close this out then?
Thank you so much. Yep, Trina. Thank you, Dr. Lynn.
Trina?
Thank you, Willie.
Okay.
Thank you for the last poll. I'm just going to go over a few events and some action items. Oh, Willie, you still talking? Go.
No, I was trying to finish my poll, but I didn't finish it. So you're missing my input. I think we'll be okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, Willie. Thank you, Dr. Lynn. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, participants. This is Black Business Month. So please go out and support our Black businesses. You can look it up. We're going to populate it in the chat how you can get involved. Also get involved, as Dr. Lynn says, we have a city council meeting coming up August 3rd, Tuesday, August 3rd. It's at 2 p.m., which it's usually at 3. So just look for that. We also have an Instagram live Respond to Racism event on August 9th, Monday. Please register for our last storytelling event with the Lake Oswego Library. You can still register. We're doing the book Beloved. That is called Deepening Our Connections. You can also order our t-shirts and donate to Respond to Racism. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for a great meeting.
Thank you all.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thanks for joining.
Good night. Thank you. Keep up the good work.
Whitley?